There is a civilization that should not exist. Not because the evidence for it is thin. The evidence is overwhelming. 17 tons of carved basalt. Colossal stone heads, some standing nearly 10 feet tall, their faces staring outward across the Gulf Coast lowlands of Mexico with an expression that is neither welcoming nor hostile, simply present, waiting. The civilization that produced these monuments flourished between roughly 1500 and 400 BCE, more than 1,000 years before the Aztec. Centuries before the Maya reached their classical peak. They built the first large ceremonial centers in Mesoamerica. They developed what may be the earliest writing system in the Western Hemisphere. They established trade networks that stretched from the Gulf Coast to the highlands of Guatemala. And then they disappeared, not slowly, not through conquest. The major Olmec centers were abandoned, their monuments deliberately buried or defaced, their population dispersed into the landscape. When archaeologists first excavated these sites in the 20th century, they found a civilization with no clear ancestors and no clear descendants. A people who seemed to emerge from nowhere and vanish into nothing. The genetics were supposed to solve this. They did not. They made it stranger. To understand why the Olmec remained so deeply puzzling, you have to start with what we thought we knew, and how little of it has held. The accepted framework goes like this. The Olmec were a Mesoamerican people, descended from the same founding populations that crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Northeast Asia, somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. They settled the Gulf Coast lowlands of what is now the Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco, a hot, humid, river-crossed landscape that proved exceptionally fertile. They developed agriculture, social hierarchy, monumental architecture, and long-distance trade. They were, in the standard account, the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the foundational civilization from which the Maya, the Zapotec, the Teotihuacan culture, and eventually the Aztec all drew essential elements. Pyramid construction, the ritual ball game, the feathered serpent deity, the 260-day ceremonial calendar. All of these appear first among the Olmec. This framework is not wrong, but it leaves out the question that the colossal heads immediately raise for anyone who stands in front of one. The faces do not look like the faces of other Mesoamerican peoples as they are depicted in Olmec art itself. The colossal heads, 17 have been found at 4 major sites, San Lorenzo, La Venta, Tres Zapotes, and Laguna de los Cerros, show wide, flat noses, thick lips, and facial proportions that have prompted more than a century of uncomfortable debate about who exactly the Olmec were representing. The debate has attracted more fringe speculation than almost any topic in New World archaeology. Theories have ranged from African contact to Atlantean origins. Most of these proposals share a common flaw. They begin with the faces and work backward to a conclusion, rather than following the evidence where it leads. But the evidence, examined carefully and without preconception, is itself surprising enough. It does not require embellishment. The first serious genomic data on ancient Mesoamerican populations began emerging in the mid-2000s, driven by advances in ancient DNA extraction that made it possible to recover usable genetic material from remains in hot, humid environments. Exactly the kind of environment that had made Olmec-era DNA recovery impossible for decades. In 2015, a landmark study in the journal Science, led by researchers at Harvard's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, analyzed the genomes of 23 ancient individuals from across Mesoamerica and the southwestern United States. The study did not target Olmec sites specifically. The preservation conditions at Gulf Coast lowland sites remain challenging, but it established baseline genetic profiles for Mesoamerican populations across different time periods. What that study found, and what subsequent research has continued to refine, is that ancient Mesoamerican populations were not genetically uniform. They were not a single founding group that dispersed and diversified in place. They showed evidence of multiple distinct ancestry streams arriving in the region at different times, with different genetic signatures. The diversity was greater than the standard Beringian migration model predicted, and in some ancient samples, particularly from the Gulf Coast region, there were signals that pointed toward an ancestry component that did not match the genetic profile of the surrounding highland populations. This is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to interpret, and genuinely important to interpret carefully. There are three frameworks researchers have proposed to explain the genetic distinctiveness of Gulf Coast populations in the Olmec period. Each one is supported by some evidence. None of them is complete. The first is the isolation model. The founders of Olmec civilization were an early arriving population of Native Americans who settled the Gulf Coast and remained relatively isolated from subsequent migration waves. Over thousands of years of genetic drift, they developed a distinct profile. The unusual elements in the data reflect not external contact, but internal divergence. This is the most conservative explanation, and in population genetics, the conservative explanation is often correct, but it struggles to account for the degree of distinctiveness observed. And it says nothing about the faces on the colossal heads. The second framework is the Pacific Coastal Migration Model, a growing body of genetic evidence anchored by a 2021 study in the journal Cell, led by researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, suggests that the Americas were populated not by a single migration event across Beringia, but by at least two distinct waves. The second wave, moving south along the Pacific coast, carried a genetic signature that differed from the first inland migration. Some researchers have proposed that Gulf Coast populations, including the ancestors of the Olmec, may have received a stronger contribution from this second coastal wave, accounting for their genetic distinctiveness relative to highland Mexican populations. This model is currently the most scientifically mainstream of the three, and it does not require any transoceanic contact. It requires only that the peopling of the Americas was more complex than a single crossing. The third framework is the one that makes archaeologists uncomfortable, and that the evidence does not yet support, but also does not yet fully exclude. A small number of researchers have proposed that the genetic signal in Gulf Coast populations reflects pre-Columbian contact with populations from outside the Americas. The specific proposal varies. Some point toward West Africa, citing the colossal head iconography and the presence of genetic markers whose distributions today cluster in West African populations. Others point toward Polynesia, where evidence of pre-Columbian contact with South America has been established by a 2020 study in Nature, demonstrating Polynesian ancestry in ancient and modern South American coastal populations. The honest answer is that the data does not currently resolve between these frameworks. What it does do is confirm that the Olmec and their descendants were not genetically simple. The founding population of Mesoamerica's first civilization was drawn from a genetic landscape more complex than the textbooks described. And the complexity has a direction. It points toward the coasts, toward the water, toward the possibility that the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific were not barriers to the people who built San Lorenzo and La Venta. They may have been roads. Now, consider what the archaeological record adds to this picture. The Olmec did not build their civilization in isolation. The basalt used for the colossal heads was quarried at the Tuxtla Mountains, more than 50 miles from San Lorenzo. Moving 17-ton stones across rivers and wetlands without wheels, without draft animals, required organizational capacity and logistical knowledge on a scale that implies prior experience. Not the first experiment of a newly settled people, the accumulated expertise of a culture that had been solving large-scale engineering problems for a long time before the monuments we can see were built. The trade networks confirm this. Olmec jade came from the Motagua River Valley in Guatemala, hundreds of miles to the southeast. Olmec obsidian came from highland Mexican sources. Pottery styles appear at sites across Mesoamerica in the formative period, suggesting not merely trade, but the movement of Olmec cultural ideas across a wide area. This was not a civilization that stayed in place. It moved, connected, exchanged. And a civilization shaped by mobility tends to be shaped by the peoples it encountered along the way. The disappearance is as poorly understood as the origin. Around 400 BCE, the major Olmec centers were abandoned. San Lorenzo shows evidence of deliberate monument destruction, colossal heads buried, altars defaced. This is not the signature of external conquest. Conquering armies do not bury their enemies' monuments. They display them. The deliberate concealment at San Lorenzo looks more like ritual termination, a civilization ending itself on its own terms for reasons that remain opaque. What happened to the people? The genetic record suggests they did not vanish. Population-wise studies, the broad genomic surveys that track ancestry contributions across time, show that the Gulf Coast lowland genetic signature does not disappear after 400 BCE. It disperses. It appears in attenuated form in subsequent Mesoamerican populations, diluted by the population movements of the Classic period, but not erased. The people who built the colossal heads had descendants. Those descendants are almost certainly alive today, among the millions of people in Veracruz, Tabasco, and the surrounding states who carry in their genomes the unread history of the first civilization of the New World. There is a colossal head at the Museo de Antropología in Salapa, Veracruz. Monument 7 from San Lorenzo, approximately 2,900 years old. It stands in a room by itself under careful lighting. The face looks at you with an expression that is difficult to describe. Not fierce, not serene. Something closer to patience. The patience of something that has been waiting a very long time to be understood. The genetics will not fully explain that face. Not yet. Possibly not ever. What it will do, as the tools improve and as more ancient samples become recoverable, is tell us with increasing precision where the people behind that face came from. How they arrived at the Gulf Coast. What populations they mixed with, when and in what direction. It will tell us, eventually, whether the water was a road, whether the Pacific coastal migration left its mark on the first Mesoamerican city, whether the founding population of the Western Hemisphere's oldest civilization was more diverse, more traveled, more connected to the wider human story than the maps we have drawn suggest. The Olmec were never what we thought. Not because the fringe theories were right, but because the mainstream story was too small, too neat, too comfortable with the idea that a civilization of this scale and this complexity could have a simple explanation. The colossal heads were always telling us something. We are only now beginning to have the tools to hear what it is,